Hello, and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to let you know about our upcoming episodes. On Tuesday, February 18th at 6:30 p.m., we'll be joined by Ed Dodson. Ed spent his career working in the financial industry, including 20 years at Fannie Mae. He's also a longtime member of the faculty at the Henry George School, having taught many of the courses in the school's core curriculum, as well as courses of his own design. He's also published extensively on the subjects of political economy and history. I expect we'll have a wide-ranging discussion, which will include comparing and contrasting the economic perspectives and proposals of Henry George and Silvio Gesell, as well as the pros and cons of incrementalism versus wholesale paradigm change. And then on Tuesday, March 4th at 1 p.m., our guest will be Philip Ullman. Philip is a social business entrepreneur who was previously the head of the Cordant Group, which was the UK's largest independent staffing company with a workforce of over 10,000 people. He's currently the chief energizer for the Mana Journey, which is an on-demand streaming platform centered on exploring the future of business and economics. I want to mention that, as always, anyone joining us live is welcome to join the conversation. To do so, just click the Raise Hand button under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. If you have your camera on, I'll bring you on screen when it's your turn. If your camera is off, we'll just hear your voice. You're free to use the Zoom chat, but just keep in mind that I'm unable to monitor the chat while the meeting is going on. And the chat will not appear in the recorded videos. So if you have something to say, I encourage you to raise your hand and join the conversation. And to be clear, this will be recorded and shared on the YouTube channels of both the Henry George School and the Silvio Gesell Foundation. All right, I'm really excited about today's episode. Perhaps unbeknownst to him, today's guest was one of the inspirations that led to the creation of this series. As I've mentioned before, Economy 2.0 was an outgrowth of a course I taught last year at the Henry George School. During that course, I expressed my personal opinion that the existing economic system is failing and cannot be saved. Obviously, that's just an opinion. No one knows for sure what the future holds. But if one believes that the failure of the conventional economy is unavoidable, it means that attempts to reform that system are pointless and perhaps even counterproductive. Such attempts amount to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. If we believe that the ship cannot be saved, the lifeboats become our top priority. As I've said in past episodes, if the existing systems of production and exchange were to ever stop functioning, it would be an existential threat to billions of people. And if that happens, it will be too late at that point to create alternative solutions for providing ourselves with all of the goods and services we need to survive. If those alternative solutions are going to save us, they need to be up and running before the collapse. When the ship is sinking, it's too late to start thinking about building lifeboats. So that's where my attention is focused, on building lifeboats. A few years ago, I started thinking about designing a lifeboat model based on the ideas of Silvio Gesell. The idea is to take Gesell's diagnosis of the problems with the conventional economy, such as poverty, ever-increasing wealth inequality, recurring economic crises, and destruction of the environment, and build an alternative model based on Gesell's proposals. The plan is to create economic zones where production and exchange take place under a different set of arrangements. The hope is to get such zones up and running before the conventional economy collapses. While the existing system continues to work, the alternative model can operate alongside it in a complementary fashion. And if the conventional system ever stops working, the zones will be available to serve as lifeboats. And as I talked to people about this idea, I realized that I wasn't the only person thinking along these lines. In fact, there are a lot of people thinking about this stuff and working outside of the conventional framework to build alternative models and systems. All of these people are designing lifeboats. And that was what inspired this series. In fact, we were originally going to call it the Lifeboat Project, but we decided that was a bit too narrow of a focus and that Economy 2.0 would cast a wider net while still encompassing the lifeboat theme. In December, we did an episode with Tim Jenkin. Tim lives in Cape Town, South Africa, and is the founder of the Community Exchange System, a global network of alternative exchange groups based on the Let's model. Tim is building lifeboats. I first heard of today's guest through Tim. So let's bring him in now. Will Ruddick joins us today from Kenya. He's the founder of an organization called Grassroots Economics. Will began his adult life as a physicist at Stanford, smashing subatomic particles together, and then somehow ended up in Africa, where he pioneered the use of complementary currencies to alleviate poverty in local communities. In a pattern we've discussed in previous episodes, Will's efforts to build alternative economic systems drew the attention of government authorities in much the same way as the local currency experiment in Virgil, Austria during the Great Depression drew the attention of the Austrian Central Bank. In the early 2000s, Will found himself in the crosshairs of the Kenyan Central Bank. Fortunately, Will's story had a happier ending than that of Virgil. Will prevailed in his legal struggle and has continued his work of creating alternative exchange systems in over 100 communities throughout Kenya. What started out as a focus on complementary currencies has evolved into something even more innovative, an exchange model called commitment pooling that doesn't require the use of currency at all. I'm excited to learn more about commitment pooling today. But first, I'd like to hear the story of how a particle physicist from Stanford made his way to Africa and started helping communities create complementary currencies. So Will, welcome to Economy 2.0. It's a pleasure to have you here after hearing so much about the great work that you do. Before we get to grassroots economics and commitment pooling, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got from California to Kenya?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Good to be here. Yeah, I grew up in Santa Cruz, California, and very much a alternative kind of hippie-esque upbringing and a lot of living in communes and whatnot. And there was always this, like real activist push to my life. And somehow I got really tired of the new age scene growing up and wanted to learn what the term energy meant from physicists and what frequency meant, from a mathematical perspective. So I went into physics to sort of rebel against all that. And it was during my master's at the University of Boulder that I had done a thesis on something called econophysics, which was basically using high energy physics, like modeling, agent-based modeling, a lot of it, to look at economic networks and see if we could kind of use the similar math we use in physics to sort of understand those things. And it got into looking at Forex data for the first time, and I, as a sort of data analyst for particle accelerators, I just tried to understand what that data could possibly mean, and spent a lot of time just kind of trying to understand economics from that perspective. And I I had a friend who sent me Bernard Leotar's book around that time. I think it was the Future of Money, and all of a sudden it seemed like money was something designable and understandable from a different perspective. And so I started going down that route quite a bit, and learned a lot from Berkshires, and reading about the history of Curitiba in Brazil, and Wargle, and all these different kind of experiments that had happened, for Kipu in Japan. And I just to me that was sort of an eye opener, and it sort of connected my science and physics background, current work at the time, into sort of that sort of activist upbringing somehow, and just kind of trying to understand, or being excited about understanding economics for the first time, rather than it being just a sort of like a political uh, theory of economics. There was something more in depth to it, and so that was the beginning for me of getting excited about that. And I kept focusing on that for quite a few years, and eventually decided to join the Peace Corps. And that's a volunteer organization in the US that basically places you in a foreign country. And because my work at Stanford, I had gotten to work with a lot of people from Shanghai, so I knew quite a bit of Mandarin. I took Mandarin in school, so I asked to go to China. And about a month before going there, they said that they'd closed the program in China completely and were going to send me to Kenya instead, and if I would want to go. And I had no idea even where that was really. And so I very quickly learned as much as I could about Kenya, and got very excited about it as well, and ended up here. So it was kind of just magic that I ended up here. And yeah, I'll pause there, but that's the story of kind of what got me to Kenya. And kind of with a lot of this background of wanting to look into economic theory, and part of the push to go into it, to come to Kenya, was also to get out of the United States as well. For me, was to try to understand economics from the point of view of uh, ancient communities, indigenous communities, trying to understand it from the point of view of, you know, what might be called global South, just kind of getting away from the American perspective. And I think that, just trying to get my mind out of that box that I had sort of been in my whole life, just felt super important. And by the time I was on a flight out here, I felt I had almost kind of escaped prison in a way, even though I ended up back in prison in Kenya. But somehow it was a really, it was an amazing feeling of like, oh wow, I get to experience a whole nother world essentially. Yeah.
So, all right. So that explains how you got there.
Yeah.
You're now in the Peace Corps. How do you get from what were you doing in the Peace Corps? What was your specific role?
I was teaching science in schools, and that included economics. And I ended up doing a lot of like, I worked with a good school here in Kenya. It was a provincial school that turned into a national school just recently, and doing things like agent-based modeling with some of the top students there, and working on um, a lot of environmental projects as well. That's another thing I've done a lot throughout my life and still do. And we were not that far from a local kind of informal settlements. And so a lot of my kind of weekends from that school were around those informal settlements, and just trying to understand the economics of what was going on there. And the first impetus was, I was looking at waste collection. I was, remembering all these stories of Curitiba, which was, focused on waste collection in Brazil back in the time. And looking at a lot of these youth groups that were around there. So there's a lot of potential for there being a workforce. There was a lot of kind of idle capacity to some degree. And so it was just, like, what was there some recipe there that could be learned from, say, Curitiba and Berkshires? And so those were the kind of the models I was coming in with. Um, so that was the beginning of what was called back then eco-pesa, which was really and pesa means money in Swahili, and eco for, environmental, ecological. And so we started doing, we as in, I got together with some interns from a group called Eco Ethics as well. So it was like a local NGO that I had met here through the school I was working with. Um, and they had given me some kind of interns to work with that were from this area, this informal settlement. And basically, we started going around and just having meetings with the elders and businesses, and just kind of exploring, having discussions, watching videos of things that were happening with like Bancos Palmas in Brazil, and what were some of like the current experiments happening and in the past, and just kind of seeing what the reaction was from the community, and then getting a really warm response, and the idea that they were seeing this being done in other places by Brazilians, for instance, and saying, oh, we could do something like that. That it looks like it was helpful there, and it could be helpful here. And so yeah, that was the kind of the impetus around Bangla and we found a local printing business that did security printing for banks. And basically, we worked with the community to design a bunch of bills, and we printed a whole bunch of these bills in different denominations and with security printing and whatnot. And I had a little shop that I stayed in the community, next to a little clinic, and basically we each business in the network started with I think it was a very small amount. It was like 50 Kenyan shillings, like 50 cents on the dollar of these little bills. And they were to have meetings and exchange and trade them themselves. So there was a lot of kind of, working with the village elders and just getting people used to that very, very small amount. Like this was like change even, within the community. And then we would host community cleanup events. So we had a store of these bills that would go out for community cleanups to pay for, because the big problem that we were trying to solve was that the city like dump trucks wouldn't come into that area. It was these narrow alleys, and these alleys, it's kind of a slum essentially, were filled with trash that was attracting, like stagnant water and, mosquitoes and malaria and all kinds of problems because of that. So the idea was to get people in the community to be incentivized to sort that trash, pull it out, sort it, put it into bags, and get it to these city trucks. So kind of essentially reclean the area. And um, I mean, this is all back like 2010 or so. So this is quite a long time ago. What is it, 2025 now or something? So 15 years ago. And so it's a little bit hard for me to remember all this. I haven't talked about it for a long time, but essentially these bills were distributed during these big events to people who would clean up the trash. They would get different amounts depending on what they were sorting, if they had sorted well. And the businesses in that area would then accept those bills from them, from the youth and whoever was cleaning the trash. So the businesses would actually organize these events. We did several of them, and the businesses would be incentivized to get everyone to come and collect the trash because they wanted to get those bills from them, because we had a system of buying back those bills over time. Right. So we had a small fund in shillings to buy those back, a very small amount every month, for like something like 500 shillings um, per person per month over time. And so that money we saw it was something like 5 times more than the cost of actually just picking up that trash by itself. Right. So we saw X amount of circulation. We saw a huge amount more trash picked up. And so that was the sort of, to me, like an easy form experiment. And even when we ended the program, like we had done as much as, bought back all the bills we had put into circulation, there was actually something like 10% of the bills that never brought back for the cash in the end, and they stayed in circulation in that community just because people enjoyed it and they were using it in like little tight groups. And so that was kind of like okay, well, you know, how could we get that type of a system to last much longer? Right? Like what could it be backed by instead of money or in addition to money? So that was the wheels started, going of like, okay, that was a successful kind of safe experiment. What would it look like if we started backing the bills with commitments, right, from the local businesses. So more like moving into what we would call like vouchers full on. And so that was the sort of the next big experiment, was to work with a neighboring community in a slum called Bangladesh. And it used to be owned by a Bangladeshi, but it's near Mombasa. And and so that was, we worked with another whole group of businesses. And in that case, the focus was, could these bills be commitments for services, products and services from this business group? And so it was a much more kind of structured um, thing. It wasn't dependent on there being a fund of donor cash anymore. And so that was it. It was in some ways a much more kind of free experiment too, because these things could kind of go anywhere. They weren't meant to sort of come back to me or get refunded in any way. And that we had a bunch of systems on that. So for instance, we had a stamp script on there. So there was these would expire over time. So this was again like pulling from Wargle and, Silvio Gesell in terms of having something like a demarrage there, like expiring vouchers in the community. And in this case, they, backed by the goods and services of this business network. So you can almost think of it as like a mall voucher, right? It was backed by a group of businesses that were a collective, like a cooperative, that were formed. And that worked very well and stayed in circulation for quite some time. In fact, it's still going today. Um, but like in its sort of like early heyday, the first kind of 3 months of it, even there was an incident where, I mean, and this is kind of mythologized at this point. I wasn't there either, but this is the story, anyways, that there was this youth crossing the railroad track in an illegal place. You're not allowed to cross the railroad track there. You're supposed to walk like 2 kilometers down. And these police jump out of a bush and say, "Hey, you crossed the railroad track in the wrong place. Now you have to give us some money." Right. This is, the highway robbery of, this is how a lot of, Kenyan police make their living. Um, and the kid didn't have any money. And he reached in his pocket and he had one of these vouchers. And he said, "Well, you can go get some soup for this. And they said, "Oh, no, 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 this is a big deal." And they brought him to the police office, and the police, commissioner in that area said, "Oh, this looks very serious. This could be something, big, And so they called a central bank, and they called what was called the CID, which is like the Kenyan CIA. And they decide to make this into something as if it was a terrorist action. And there had been a lot of like Al-Shabaab terrorism stuff going on around this time. This is like early 2011, 2012, early 2012. And so, yeah, we had, riot police come in and basically break down doors and like take our little HP printer. And it was, a big, big fuss. All of our team ended up in jail. Quite a few community people ended up in jail. And yeah, it was surreal at the time. I brought in all my books from Curitiba and little presentations and whatnot, and they were like, "Oh, that's evidence. You've done something really wrong here." And of course, we had the village elders and the chief and everything had been fine with everything. So it was um, yeah, it was one of those experiences where you feel like society is really strange somehow, and that you've broken some, kind of invisible, like the emperor wears no clothes kind of rule. And but no one really knows exactly what that rule is or we'll talk about it. So we ended up in court, and they were charging us finally with forgery, even though these vouchers look nothing like a Kenyan shilling or anything else. And eventually it was sort of like, well, what is it forgery of if it's not the Kenyan shilling? It's just like a forgery of the idea of money. And we did a petition, and we had, like the folks from uh, ISS, Erasmus, so all over the world kind of signed this petition saying like, this is somehow, even back then, a fairly normal thing. Like this has been done in lots of other countries, like, kind of chill out kind of petition. And the director of public prosecution eventually took the court aside and wrote a letter and saying, technically we can find nothing in the Constitution that says this is illegal. Um, which is interesting if we go back to like the Wargol case and what was illegal in the case of Wargol. So anyways, there's some interesting parallels there. And they closed the case, and so we won, and that was in some ways we took that little letter as our sort of permission to keep going, and we've never really looked back. I mean, since then we work with the Red Cross, and we've worked with the World Food Program and all these kind of other organizations, and we've done a lot of like legal due diligence. We've had lawyers go in and say, exactly, which regulatory blah blah blah, would this type of stuff fit in. And that's been an interesting thing. I mean, the whole legal, regulatory environment to sort of, bottleneck and stop alternative forms of exchange is really a fairly ancient form of, a creation of an extractive controlled environment, right? Like we go back to like the hut taxes, in Kenya, the very first introductions of money here, there was a lot of trying to outlaw alternative forms of exchange and force people into very specific ones. And so this, there's a lot going on where, I mean, if we get into blockchain today and all this kind of, many, many forms of exchange, I mean, you and I are exchanging words right now. If, if a lot of these, like the direction of these regulations were in place, if we were not exchanging money right now and paying tax for it, for this exchange that we're doing right now, that would be considered illegal. And there's a lot of countries, I mean, even France today it's illegal to trade any professional services without paying taxes for it, right? So there's a big trajectory around stopping any form of exchange. And yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, let me pause there. Yeah.
So I want to get into, how your complementary currency experiments evolved into the current paradigm, and have you describe commitment pooling. But before we get to that, has there been any, have you had any further interaction with the legal authorities, given that it's been, what, 15 years since then, and you've continued to operate and develop and expand? Um, it would be almost unprecedented, as far as I know, for someone to do what you're doing and to not come up against the authorities and have them want to do everything in their power um, to shut you down. Has that
Yeah.
not been the case?
Well, I mean, with the court case and kind of even before it was, we had won it. There was this one woman who came and testified, and this, the court says, what were you doing? Why were you doing this thing that looked like terrorism or whatever? And this is an old lady, and she said, something to the effect of, I didn't have money to pay my daughter's school fees, but I had some tomatoes, you know, and that was it. And if that's going to be illegal to exchange tomatoes or commitments for tomatoes, that's essentially what the vouchers were to her for school fees. Well, if she couldn't do that, well, then my daughter wouldn't go to school, and I don't have Kenyan shillings. And so, what's my responsibility as a parent? As like how is that supposed to work exactly? Am I being punished for not having money, and therefore I can't trade my tomatoes? Anyways, I mean, it would the way it came out in the court and even publicly was so damning of the government, right? To how do you have the audacity to tell this woman she can't do this thing? Um, how on earth? It was just ridiculous. And actually, the government became a laughing stock. There was a show called Churchill Show. There was another one I can't remember right now, but it was where it was just people were just laughing. They were just like, really? Like how on earth? So there was an incredulity. It's a little bit like people are the incredulity of maybe what's happening with the finances of America right now. If the emperor has no clothes, how dare you, how could you, stop this? So there was a little bit of that, um, chutzpah and, feeling behind all of this that I think made it clear. But, in the years since then, um, we worked with many communities quite quickly to kind of replicate kind of what was going on there, and we had some women from that community that went and trained other communities and just did the same thing. And we very quickly started working with a state organization like the Cross actually has a mandate from the government. They're sort of a parastatal organization. They're a very strange organization. They're essentially parastatal, and we ended up kind of training and backstopping and eventually developing some technologies behind this stuff to do digital versions of this instead of paper. And so that's been something where it's like, we've been in all the refugee camps around Kenya for years and years and still are. And those programs are all run by you. How about now, Josh? Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. See if that's better.
So far, so
So
good.
yeah, I would just, the whole thing of, working through a lot of other organizations that were implementing this stuff and, doing it all in a very transparent way as well. I mean, part of the beauty of we started using public ledgers. So, we were worried that this would happen again with the courts and whatnot. So we didn't want to make ourselves central to rolling this stuff out. We didn't, so for digital systems, you don't want everything on your server that could be just shut down by the government. So that was one of the pushes to go into a decentralized ledgers. And so that was one of the pushes to go into blockchain, which, produces a lot of um, evidence of kind of what's happening in these networks. And so there's a lot of, we have got visualizations. You can see, what's going on in these networks. And here, it's Red Cross using these to support refugees and develop economies and support environmental programs and, all kinds of, problems around droughts and whatnot. So that's been kind of the way to push this stuff for me is, we're a nonprofit foundation. All of our data is very transparent. And, if you really wanted to take this stuff down, you're gonna have to go through now the Red Cross to do it. Um, and it's going to be even more public than it was before. And so for the government to really justify it, I think is quite hard. And we've also, like the systems with Demirage as well. As well as the commitment pooling, which we'll get into. There actually all are several ways to work with local authorities that we've done in a lot of areas where some of that demurrage actually goes to support the local administration. And that's been a really nice way for them to be part of the programs. And in some cases, that's been more revenue than they've ever got actually as like because mostly they're getting trickled down from the national government. They actually never get anything from the local community, and so this kind of actually pulled them into it. So there's a lot of ways where, if you think about the Wargle experiment and the demurrage as a sort of a taxation method that helped, the community prosper, that's also quite possible within these. So I think, for governments to look at these things creatively is really powerful. And now that we've moved into pooling, which is essentially to say, imagine many, many, many of these communities starting their own little Wargles, right? Like imagine if the Wargle experiment had done very well and you've got a Wargle, you've got, one for each town around Wargle, what would happen? How would those guys start trading with each other? And that's the good problem that we kind of got into, right? So we had this problem even with the paper vouchers, like, well, how would that work exactly? And we started doing a project with the World Food Program, I don't know, 4 years ago or so, maybe it was five. And we saw these communities doing a very particular thing with the vouchers. They were circulating them much, much more than any other community that we had seen. And because most of those communities that we had worked with before, like the main technique of circulation was market days, and somehow, there'd be sports events and things like that. There would be all, kind of mixers and whatnot, but mostly it was just market days. But this community, it was in Kitui, which is kind of center of Kenya. They had started doing this thing that they called Mwedia, and it's a Bantu word. Here on the coast where I live, it's called Mweria. And there's a whole bunch of other words for it that are very different than that. Like Aluas call it Nyoluoro, and there's a it seems like every culture around the world has some version of this if you go back far enough. And academically, they're called rotating labor associations. So what they would do is the person hosting this type of event, they're essentially asking the community for a loan. They're saying, I need everyone to come and help me with my house or my farm, right? Like during harvest season. And they'll get a big group of people there to help them. And they give a commitment or promise that they will come help them in the future. And that uh, that tradition in a lot of these communities had stopped quite a long time ago because they didn't have the means to kind of support that group coming into their home. They'd have to like cook lunch and all this kind of stuff for them. And so this was a big, a drought-stricken area. And also those traditions had died off. A lot of them had died off during kind of the colonial period and hut taxation. And a lot of them had transitioned into things like merry-go-round. So there's an interesting trajectory around these ancient practices into kind of some of the stuff we see today. Merry-go-rounds are like tabletop banking, for instance. So they would take these traditions into circulating national currency. So they would use these vouchers to appreciate and pay for, and in a way give their commitments that they would come and help the other community members over time. And so basically those vouchers would end up circulating around these communities during these labor practices, these labor events. And we started studying those for a few years. And we ended up working with what are called the kayas here, which are these kind of ancient indigenous forests that are, the term kaya actually means something like society. It's a kind of a fractal word. It's a little bit like the Greek oikos, if you're familiar with that. Like it means home, it means society, it means kind of all the resources and sacred forest. It's and these kind of ancient societies would have that system called mueria to distribute labor and resources around the community. And so essentially you would have something like an intangible commons where each person or each family would commit to a certain amount of labor within the community um, over a time period and as well as resources. And so you would be able to kind of draw upon that comment, like as if you had an intangible seed bank and you could take out loans from that seed bank, right? And so you as a family could say, I need this much work. I promise to give back into the future. And you would have many kind of layers of these muerias that would go into things like funerals or weddings or connected muerias between your uncle's family and those would kind of spread out into an entire clan. And it was very much a reputation system, and there was very much limits as well on that reciprocity. So if someone were to take out, you know, use the commitments of the community and get a lot of help and didn't reciprocate over like an entire season, quite often they would be asked to pay some sort of fine, like and often ceremonial stuff like a black chicken and a white goat, um, or in the end be excluded from that in the future, right? So like you would end up with this kind of collective agreement. And so that's been sort of the last few years of just trying to understand the protocols and functions, kind of those systems. And what we've really kind of sort of understood is that the vouchers themselves, like what we used to call currencies and or think of as currencies, were really just a form of commitment. And if those commitments could be more personalized, right? Like if it's a commitment for Sally's bananas or, John's labor, and then you pool those commitments together, right? So you have a store of those commitments that people can reciprocally draw from, right? So that store of commitments, it stays in value because it keeps circulating through the community. That actually worked much better as a model in terms of, many things, in terms of being able to identify particular goods and services, to be able to do resource coordination without an obfuscation layer of a currency, right? Because when we had a single voucher across a large group, again, it's a little bit like a corporation. You have this kind of um, organizational layer that represents many people's commitments. And if you could actually, instead of that, dive down into individual commitments, it seemed to work much better, and you get a lot more flow. And so that's been the learning, and that's where we've been kind of moving a lot with the technology. We still have groups or whole communities in some cases making vouchers that look a lot like might look like Wargle, for instance. But more and more and more, we have many of those things, groups connecting to each other, or individuals connecting to each other, or businesses connecting to each other by making their own commitments. And the schema for expressing those commitments is a little bit like creating a Wargle. If you think of, you might think of Wargle as a commitment for whatever was in their reserve, or for, tax relief or something like this. Well, these are commitments for like a gift card, right? And legally, we use the form of airtime credit or a bus ticket to represent these things, right? So you're essentially making an IOU, or a credit obligation. And then we create a structure where you can pool those things. And anyone can also create these pools, or groups can create pools as well. And so the pool, again, it's a holding. It's really a curation, you can think of it, of valuable offerings, what that they find valuable. It has a relative value index, which is essentially a price index that tells you the relative value across the different commitments, or assets in that pool. It has limitations in there. So there's a maximum amount the community will say, like how many of Josh's um, vouchers can go into that pool, right? In order to pull out other stuff and to main balance in the pool. And then there's the ability to exchange and swap within those pools as well, and as well as deposit or seed. So the pools start with an amount of something in it, right? So there has to start with something that's like the seed. That in some cases that can actually start with promises of national currency. We've done quite a bit of that with aid organizations and foundations, and even Islamic finance groups, like Islamic endowments. So there's something in there to begin with, right? That can often be even like the commitments of the elders for some resources. And community members are allowed to exchange their commitments for what's in there, right? So they're swapping essentially their commitments for those, and then they're using those commitments. They're calling on them, right? So I need those resources, and what's left in the pool is their commitment, which is really their liability. It's their debt, right? And so you in some ways you can look at a common pool resource as a mutual credit as well. If you look at access to the common pool as credit, and what's left in the pool as the obligation of those people, then you have a very nuanced mutual credit, right? You can actually, there's a very rich layer underneath the view of debt and credit, and that's been really useful for us. And so that's where we've gone with all these. So you can call the individual vouchers currencies, and some groups do. Some call them time banks or time credits. Some call them whatever. At the point where you actually want to combine those and connect them to each other, right? Or exchange them for each other, that's the space now we've really gotten into. It's a little bit more like it's a yin space, it's a space of connection. And that's been really the focus now for many years now. And yes, like the yang, or the expression of value is still there. That's the offering, that's the commitment of a group or of an individual or a business. But now what's the space that actually enables them to connect? And then can individuals or groups as well manage those spaces? And that's kind of what's been interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the connection between the communities that is the most interesting, and quite frankly, confusing aspect for me, because there are a lot of different alternative models that can be employed at a small scale, but which are based on personal relationships and trust. And so as soon as the number of people involved gets too large for people to know each other and trust each other, then those forces become inoperative, and there needs to be a system that replaces those things. And that's what I know. You know Tim Jenkin. We had him as a guest in December, and he facilitates exchange between the thousands of different groups all around the world that are part of the community exchange system. Um, I had a hard time wrapping my head around the mechanics of how that intergroup exchange works. Um, can you describe how, so I understand how the idea of a commitment pool could be operative at the level of a village. But how how can an architecture be set up that allows this commitment pool to somehow connect with a commitment pool where maybe none of the people know each other personally?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the connector between pools is common commitment. So for instance, you have let's say you have someone we're working with some groups in the US now and in Mississippi and they're connecting Black run businesses in different communities around the area. And so you have a pool that is a curation of think of them as like gift cards. They could be hour tokens or commitments for hours of labor. They're, in some cases, they're commitments for dollars worth of uh, mechanic work. And so you've got that curation, and that curation is being held by some sort of pool steward, right? So there's a group or an individual that says these are commitments that they're holding, and they're willing to allow them to exchange across. And in some cases, you could have many people managing that. It could be an individual, but now you have a group, let's say over here in a neighboring town or somewhere else. If that group, let's say those mechanic vouchers are in this group here, and they're also present in that group over here, right? So that same mechanic, let's say, is the network, the connection that spans those communities. It means if like I've got a will that's allowed, a will voucher that's allowed into that pool. In other words, I can exchange my will up to some limit for that mechanic voucher. It means I could also push that mechanic voucher into here to this other pool to pull out a Sally to do some sewing for me, right? So in other words, people like their shared commitment essentially the is the glue that kind of holds these together. And that's essentially what it looks like in these rural communities as well. Like you span across an entire clan of many, many villages, and you have the connective tissue, the social tissue that would hold them together would be Aunt Sally, is there in between, and she's got commitments in this group as well as that group. Or you can also think of it as her reputation across those is actually what's flowing through those. And so that's essentially what's happening. We can actually think of these pools not even we can, the term group is a really special term. And when we think about group nouns for humans, or any sort of group nouns, like a flock of birds or a group of humans, well, like quite often linguistically across most of Africa here, like the original word for a group of humans, like the word chama, for instance, in Swahili, it derives back from the name for this practice, actually. So like you would have a family of humans, you might have clans, but like actually a group of neighbors or a group of people that share value together, they would be used names like Amweria of people, right? That would be a very, the term group was people who have some sort of overlap between what they value together, right? That we're actually sharing value and doing these kind of customs together. That was a group. That's literally the definition of a group of humans. In a lot of these languages, you go to the etymology of the term group, you go back to these original structures of human society. And so that's, in simple terms, I think, you could almost think of it as like a vending machine where there's, me personally, I value all these other people and services. I have my own resources that in time that I value. I internally myself have an agreement where I'm willing to offer my consulting services in exchange for let's say it's money, let's say it's other things. I have this agreement space that I've created internally myself. You can do that as a community as well, but you can also do it. My neighbor also has an agreement space that he's created, right? And if our two agreement spaces, our two pools have an overlap, well, then we have the ability to exchange between us fairly, right? And so that's, if we think about the Mueria, these traditions, the term group, it was not an organization, it, right? That we think of like a corporation or something like this. It was an overlap between everyone's value systems that enabled that flow and trust to flow. Yep.
So in my introductory remarks, I talked about my personal view that the conventional economy is headed off a cliff. Um, and I spoke about my ideas of creating an alternative model which could operate both in a complementary fashion, which is before the conventional system crashes, and then potentially in an alternative fashion to replace the system
Yeah.
that supports the lives of 8 billion people. Um, do you think of what you're doing as complementary, alternative, or both?
I mean, I think of it as the method of our great grandmothers, so I think it's really ancient. And at the same time, I think there's, like there's a technology layer there that, you know, um, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to supposedly decentralized technologies. I mean, we have a tech team that's working a lot on having much more peer-to-peer systems. I mean, we do use blockchain now, but you can also just think of a blockchain as a single consensus layer, right? Not everyone's running the blockchain, right? So it is its own little compartmentalized ledger system. So, how does it work to actually recreate these types of systems? And I think that, without going too much into the tech right now, there's a lot of people need national currency right now. You could think of it as like a little bit like heroin, right? There's a very strong addiction and need for it that's, purposely been pushed and pushed and pushed. Um, and there's what I think of as kind of like a methadone type approach to heroin addiction, which is essentially to say, if I have an agreement where I say I'm willing to offer this service that my labor, and I'm willing to offer it for national currency, well, that's a little mini bilateral pool already, right? We've created that. If we can express that in a form that says, okay, well, George will also offer his bananas for money as well, and we can connect those two pools together such that we can actually leapfrog across those pools without actually needing the money, right? This is also called, quite often called like multilateral clearing or obligation clearing. We can actually skip the money step, right? And so a lot of what we're doing right now is working with just normal businesses and saying, "Oh, would you like to make a free gift card that you own completely?" And so blockchain and a lot of these decentralized techs, that's quite simply to do. And so we've built a little website called Sarafu.network, which is open source and free to copy it, is just a simple way for a business to say, "Oh, I'm willing to offer X, Y, and Z services," right? And they can denominate that in any way they want to. They can denominate it in number of apples, or they can say US dollars, or whatever they would like to say. That's their expression. That thing itself could be considered a community currency, right? You could have a group express their value in that way, it could circulate. And then you can create pools on that website as well. And so basically that person can say, I'm willing to offer this, and I'm going to create a pool. I'm going to put those in the pool, these little, like my vending machine, and I'm willing to accept dollars for that thing, right? Well, there's quite a few ways in which now we can route around those dollars so that you actually don't need the actual dollar anymore. And as the pools grow, like let's say there's multiple now assets in that pool, they can route to each other without having to route through the dollar. And so I see this as a, again, like a methadone approach. There's still the dollar there. People are still needing initially to say, okay, well, where do I get my dollars? I got to pay my rent. But there's a way to essentially wean the system from dollars by bypassing them, right? And as we get a more full and rich network, well, there's no reason to, unless if you absolutely need dollars, wonderful. If they're there, take them out. There's again, like with you go cold turkey on heroin and you often die, and that is a real situation, right? So there's got to be some sort of, again, methadone is, if you're not familiar with it, for people, it's a weaning drug to get off of heroin, right? So extreme heroin addiction can be super deadly, and stopping it can also be deadly. And so this is a way of essentially letting the circuitry in your body come back together as you stop heroin. It's a way of weaning or slowly getting off of the drug. And so I mean, some communities can do that very fast. Some don't need quote unquote methadone at all. Wonderful. And this is kind of a part of the problem with a lot of like maybe some of the community currency approaches in the world is they tend to idealize this sort of like, going cold turkey approach, and it doesn't work, and people become demoralized and give up kind of thing. And so this is kind of, been a way that we can approach and work with communities and really just ask them, first off, how did your parents and grandparents survive? What did they do? Oh, there was a method. It was called Mueria. There's a whole bunch of, it was kind of a heart of society. And, how did that work? And then we can say, okay, great. We can just think of national currency as a resource within that system, right? It's one of their resources. It's one of their most scarce resources, but it's still there, right? And we say, okay, great. What's the system of tying back together that community, getting them to be able to exchange without having to go through that national currency system? Yeah.
I've still got the same question. Let me rephrase it.
Okay,
The issue which occurs to me as I try to wrap my head around what you're describing is scalability. The whole idea of stewardship of individual pools seems like it's not very scalable. But perhaps that's just because I have not thought deeply enough into a new paradigm. Do you view this approach as something that could be scaled to eventually be able to facilitate large scale division of labor, the manufacture and production of complex products, because that's a very different
yeah.
process than exchanging services that one person provides for products that one person creates.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's terribly different than what John Maynard Keynes was suggesting with his clearing model back at the Bretton Woods conference, where he had the Bancor as a unit of account that wasn't really actually meant to be traded so much. It's just meant to be an index against all of the commodities in different nations. So if you imagine, again, like this example of the vending machine, if you're offering, like, let's say you work for a university and you say, what's your contract with the university look like exactly? Well, you're offering some X amount of services, they get validated, you get money, right? Well, that is itself, if we can imagine it in this space, a rudimentary pool, right? It's already a bilateral connection that you have. It's a connection between your services, your commitments for services, and commitments for national currency. So it's there, right? If we imagine that a network of those could be accessible and transparent, a vast network. So in other words, if you were to register your contract with the university as a voucher and pool and have the university pay you through that agreement, right? This is just a formalization, it's a schema. Well, nothing would change, right? You would get the same money, right? But what would be different would be that you could optionally potentially sell your vouchers or allow anyone to use that pool as well. So if you were to offer me some of your services, I could now swap those into your pool to pull out some of the money from the university, for instance, right? If and that might not be with your entire salary, but the idea that like imagine you have hundreds of businesses across your community that are expressing their commitments, as vouchers, as gift cards, as business contracts in a public manner. That's essentially creates this ability to weave through that network, right? And of course there can be larger pools managed by groups or even by we're working with several universities that have pools now, and they actually have money in those pools that students as well as local shops can take out. And so the pool ends up with a bunch of commitments from the student body for doing tutoring hours. And this is a university called Lucania. And they have a way of saying, well, if you don't pull your commitments back out of that pool, you need to do X, Y, and Z service with the community before you graduate, for instance. And so the the scalability to me is the idea that you have networks. If you go to like here, I'll put a URL here, viz.sarafu.network. That's the last month of trade across all of these networks in Kenya. And what you can see there is that these little tiny business contracts can span across these entire networks, right? And so the beauty of decentralized ledgers and the internet and what was called maybe Web3 is that if we can express our services in this way with each other, we can route through those, right? And we can actually, so if the dollar is going to drop out the bottom of all of those, we can actually route around the dollar, right? So I can go from a Joseph to a Will without having to go through that dollar anymore, right? It's just a reference point at that point, right? So that's to me the strategy, sort of this kind of methadone slash get them on the bus type strategy is that if we can get enough businesses to simply make free, make gift cards, make business contracts on decentralized ledger systems, it means that we can actually start credit clearing and routing through those. And one of the biggest examples of this has been done in I believe it's Sardinia. It's called Tetris. And if you look up multilateral obligation clearing, you'll see a paper by Thomas Fleischman that talks about something like 60,000 businesses in Sardinia that were, no, it's not Sardinia. I can't remember right now off the top of my head, somewhere in Eastern Europe, that were registering their unpaid invoices, so their obligations, into a system that would actually find loops within that system and clear common debts. So like if I have a debt with you and you have a debt with Tom and Tom has a debt with me, you can actually clear all those together. You can route through the system, and they've increased their national economy by something like 20 to 30% just by having that type of system. And there's a company now called Ledger Loops and Mutual Credit Services that's doing a lot of this stuff around like Lancaster. I think there's a Lancaster Loops as well in UK. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff. And the work of Tim Jenkins in South Africa is doing a lot of the similar kind of routing mechanisms through these commitment networks. And so the scalability is not about it's not about organization or the size of pools. It's about people just creating networks of these and using them initially as they would for national currency. And that's the biggest usage of a lot of these systems now that we've developed in Kenya is simply on and offboarding national currency to start. And then it starts moving in, as the currency. So like, for instance, let's say Red Cross puts a money into a pool, people can exchange for that money, but eventually that money is not in there anymore. And what's left is their commitments and mutual debts with each other, and they can still exchange with each other. Money may come in and out of that. That's the methadone, right? But eventually they're able to start just operating. And eventually that money's gone completely. Well, they still have the system. It's still there. Right. So they have a system of credit and debt with each other that they can keep operating, keep working fairly together, even when the money's gone.
Okay, this is straining my brain. So I want to I want to probe this from the confines of my preconceived notions. Whenever one talks about the subject of money, why money exists, how money came into existence, what functions it performs, kind of the starting point is the coincidence of wants problem, which is that if you've got three individuals, individual A produces apples and wants milk. Individual B produces milk and wants beef. Individual B produces beef and wants apples. There is no way to facilitate mutually beneficial exchange between those three people via direct exchange, because there is not a coincidence of wants. And overcoming that, going around that problem, is thought to be one of the primary functions of money. Money is a medium of exchange. It is fungible. It means that A does not need to have what B wants in order to be able to get what he or she wants from B, because a generally acceptable instrument is inserted into the process, which is fungible, which makes it so that you do not need to have a coincidence of wants in order to accomplish exchange. So my question to you is this paradigm that you are describing one based on fungibility, or is it based on a more sophisticated, digitally enabled methodology for discovering coincidences of wants and facilitating what essentially boils down to direct exchange?
Yeah, I mean, there's a scale component with the technology that creates an efficiency that isn't is hard to replicate without. But I just want to go back to the village example again. So you've got, let's say, five families that live around each other, and one's got apples, one's got mud for houses, one's got some really good skills of weaving baskets and whatnot. And they might have a lot of very similar services as well, and just might need those as well. And so the idea that there is a common pool resource, and this idea predates anything like direct barter by far. And it's the main system that seems like all human societies have in common. And so there's something missing in the story of barter money kind of thing. And it's a big gap. And so what happens in that system is that I mean, there's variations of it, but essentially you have a commitment network where you have a bunch of people that have an agreement that if this person asks for these commodities, he's able to pull them from the community and give back his commitment for future work or future efforts. Right. So that exchange mechanism, which we're naively calling commitment pooling, just not to have a better word for it, the idea that there's an intangible commons. So this gets into like the work of Eleanor Ostrom, for instance, in terms of commons. You have a non-tangible commons of reputation, commitment, trust within a community, right? Where I can say, Bob's got some apples. I need some apples. I have a bicycle. He doesn't need that right now, but I can go to Bob and say, I need some apples right now. And I'm committing to the community that I will provide my bicycle later. Okay. So I get the apples. That debt of my bicycle is there in the community. He could pull it out if he wanted to, but anyone can pull it out. Right. And that credit and debt system can rotate and find balance within that system. And that seems to be the actual most ancient economic system on the planet. And it also looks very similar to something that's happening in like mycorrhizal fungi and trading nutrients across plants. So there's something that we really need to understand about those types of networks. It's a type of resource coordination system. right? Trust is very important in that system. And if you have a system like that, well, you can think of, the store of value in that system is to say, well, we're all storing value ourselves, right? Like what's the famous saying? But like my brother stores, I store my meat in the belly of my brother. I think it's a quote from like a tribe in Brazil. Um, you have a medium of exchange, which is not a thing, it's a space, right? You have a space of exchange rather than a singular medium of exchange. And it could be that, we have all kinds of examples of units of account being used across all of these communities, right? So a day's labor can be a unit of account. Sizes of gourds would have been used as units of accounts for different types of grains. So there's all kinds of stuff like that. And then you have, this push into now, monetary thing. I mean, it's really interesting to think about the origin of the word money comes from Juno Moneta. Obviously, it's much older than that, probably as well, but it's where we get our word money from. And Juno is the goddess Hera from Greek mythology, and it was the Roman version of that. And essentially, after Rome had been destroyed, so the first, as I understand, my history of Rome is not that great, but the first origin of Rome was essentially a bunch of um, militias, groups that would go and protect towns in exchange for the Greek coins, right? So it was a protectionist racket, kind of like a mafia somehow. And maybe in some cases they actually did protect towns. And they got sacked by the Gauls at some point early on. So that was like the first fall of Rome. And when they rebuilt, these kind of generals said, well, we need to actually control the mints themselves. We're not going to depend on the coins of the Greeks anymore. And they decided to put they captured a mint and they put it into the temple of Juno. And Juno is the kind of the goddess of, it's kind of symbolic. They stamped her image on it as well, kind of like In God We Trust in America. And Juno is the goddess. She holds what is it, the cornucopia. She's the goddess of the harvest and she protects the wealth. She's also the peacock eyes. So she's kind of always watchful, protection of the wealth. And they demanded that currency as taxation for paying their armies to protect people, right? That was, and that tradition of money being used in that very particular way as taxation to pay armies to protect people, it it went farther back than that, but that tradition and something very similar to it, and we can think of it as a traditional practice, just like you could the mueria, that tradition has been passed down and it's morphed in many, many, many different ways, but essentially it got, passed down to the feudal system. It got passed down to the, colonization, imperial system. It got passed into the nation states. Um, yeah. And so anyways, it's interesting to think about, like if we think about money from that perspective, it helped them manage a vast network quite efficiently. It had a lot of problems to it. Um, and there's this story of, like that it was something that replaced barter, but it didn't actually. It came in, specifically in Kenya, you can look at the history of what it actually replaced, and it certainly replaced common pool resource management.
I want to quickly mention something that I mentioned at the top, which is that I'm unable to look at the chat while this conversation is going on. I would imagine, Will, you probably can't either. I noticed that there are a lot of people writing in the chat. I would encourage you all to raise your hands and join the conversation if what you have to say, wants to be part of the conversation. Having said that, Will, I've spent a lot of time doing battle with Bitcoiners. Um, and the reason for that is because I joined Twitter for the purpose of promoting my work on on behalf of Silvio Gasel's perspective. And I thought to myself, well, um, the Bitcoiners share the root belief that motivated Silvio Gasel's life and work, which was to say that conventional money is fundamentally flawed and needs to be replaced with something that makes more sense. Um, and I thought that the Bitcoin community would potentially be receptive to Gasel's analysis of that subject. That has not so far really turned out to be the case. Those folks have not been very responsive to Gasel's ideas. Um, but something that I think I hear in what you're saying and what I often hear from those folks appears to me to be opposite one another, which with relation to the question of trust. Um, Bitcoiners often say that they are trying to create a system which does not require trust, a system which works in the absence of trust. Um, what I think I hear you saying, if I'm understanding correctly, is that you're creating an architecture for propagation of trust beyond the one-to-one or small group networks within which trust can work in real life via digital technologies. Um, would you, am I understanding you correctly? And what is the role of trust in the alternative future system of exchange that you hope humanity develops?
Yeah, I think trust is central. I mean, just to mention Bitcoin for a second, most of the world of Bitcoin and blockchain right now is simply a wealth transfer, right? What's happening is BlackRock, for instance, is one of the biggest owners of Bitcoin, and they're probably the worst organization in the entire planet. And so there's a lot of wealth being moved into blockchain for various reasons, and one of those is anonymity, a lack of liability, a lot of decentralized autonomous organizations, like organizations running through blockchain, where you can sell your access token or your shares now to anyone without anyone being able to know even who that is. So it's a way of obfuscating that we've never even really seen before. I mean, it's very hard to know who the shareholders of BlackRock are, and even harder now if BlackRock is actually moving all of that into, essentially anonymous blockchain addresses as well that control contracts and whatnot. So there's a lot of crap, the same crap, the usual crap being transferred on here. And I kind of, there's a lot of the rails of blockchain, the technology in there that also enables a lot of other types of agreement formation. So that's to me what's exciting about the technology. There's a lot of things outside of blockchain now that are doing things like Noster.com, for instance, is something exciting where you can create much more node to relay or peer-to-peer architectures without central blockchains involved. So there's a lot, what's the beauty, I would say, of a lot of the blockchain system is that you can create agreements that connect across a lot of things. You can also create really crappy agreements that obfuscate liability and just try to do wealth transfer. And that's what a lot of what's going on is. So I don't think of Bitcoin or blockchain as a panacea in any way. And I think, it's a stepping stone as we have it right now. And, moving into much, much more trust-based systems to me is absolutely the goal. And, rebuilding trust to me is essentially, rebuilding a healthy human habitat and society and, reconnecting all of our value systems back into a cohesive whole and becoming more conscious as a species on the planet. Um, so yeah, yeah. I think we're in the same. I also have a lot of disagreements with Bitcoiners and whatnot, but at the same time, it's sort of like I can see that, there's a trajectory, there's kind of this next step going on in terms of what is the architecture in which we can actually build kind of unenclosable uh, protocols, right? So I really go back. So to me, the main protocol that we talk about, this commitment pooling, has four functions. It has value curation, right? That can be implemented in a lot of ways. It's essentially, what is it that you find valuable? There's relative valuation within that curation, right? How do we actually establish relative value of a Will versus a Josh, or sticks versus mud? Then we have limitation, right, which actually limits how much can go within those pools. And then there's exchange. So there's four functions. It's curation, valuation, limitation, and exchange. Those can be stewarded in a lot of different ways, but those essentially enable us to connect between, as we've talked about, common commitments, common values across networks. And I think that, if we look at protocols are like the syntax of language. It's kind of like you express protocols like genes express DNA, you could say, right? In different ways. So I think that if we get down to the protocols of things like common resource pooling, right? And we say, how do we express those? We say, oh, is blockchain a viable place to express those types of agreements? I think yes, and maybe it could be much better, and it could be in many different ways. I also think that, for instance, sending Morse code on Donald Trump's sewage pipes, it can send a message to Josh. I don't care that they're Donald Trump sewage pipes, right? If you get the concept of like hacking the system, right? There's a system there that works in a lot of ways. And if we can send signals across it, well, we can do a lot of potentially very beautiful things. And if we can also pull that system out of Donald Trump's sewage pipe and actually be able to run our own independent systems, all the better. Yeah.
Well, I'll just express my personal hope that this new universe of digital technology, of blockchain, of Web3 becomes a vehicle for the proliferation and elaboration of trust rather than the elimination of it. It seems to me like that's a, um, a completely opposite mindset, and I wonder if we have to choose, or if there is potential for collaboration and dialogue between people who have really very different agendas. But we've got a hand raised, and I want to bring in Giannis. Giannis, welcome. Go ahead and yeah.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Will. This is a very uh, guttural presentation, and thank you for bringing up the importance of this primordial humane trait and nature, which thankfully we haven't lost, despite this
Yeah.
heavy layer of obscure technology, industrialism, and what have you. It looks like we have maintained it. So that's a hopeful sign. Now, another note of caution, I raised it also in the chat, but let me articulate it, is whenever there is this synergistic value exchange networks, um, the prime one that comes to my mind is like family. Families have always worked in these non-monetized exchange and silent mutual obligations, which either they get fulfilled, they don't get fulfilled, there is conflict, there is the resolution. But families, for I don't know how long can we say the family exists, is a social um, system that still works today. However, there is the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is called government. And what government does, which is nothing but government is nothing but a small, super powerful um, private corporation. That's what it is de facto, and that's how it operates infallibly. Um, and they can come and they can tamper and they can actually undermine and destroy these networks by coming and heavy-handedly says, "Oh, you guys gonna exchange bananas for tutoring? Here, I have free tutors, the best tutors the country can provide for free." And it automatically will kill you. And I've seen many examples like that where people say, "Well, I like what you can offer me, but uh, can you get somebody to pay for it? Like either they wanna get it for free. I mean, that goes to the trust deficit that exists prima facie in any human encounter. But there is so much so-called free paid for by government programs, and people do not think they need this care and trust, localized networks. So how would you shield your projects, these networks, these niche networks from this insidious and destructive external intervention, and how you could scale up and then until government tells you, whoa, 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 you guys have grown up too much, you are too big, blah, 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 I'm going to tax everything out, I'm going to take your property, whatever you have created through your network, I'm going to take it away because you guys owe taxes and things like that. So can you tackle this behemoth of governmental intervention? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yanis. Yeah, it's I've my partner is French, and I've just recently gotten to stay in Normandy for the first time for about a month, and with her family in northern France, and and everyone's very, very comfortable. I mean, France isn't the most, I guess, socialist state in the world, but compared to Kenya or even the US, it gosh, it seemed everyone was extremely, extremely comfortable. And I have seen that situation where, government is or some or donors or whatever is just saying, "Oh, well, we'll just give you free stuff." And I mean, the cash handout world of the Red Cross or aid organizations where they, just hand out money and then eventually they walk away and there's a big collapse. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff all the time, and then people just complain to government again, say, "Give us more stuff again." And so that's it's super symptomatic of the entire colonial method, sort of to infantilize society, right? And the same with, if you look at the result of Christianity in a lot of places, it's everyone's calling to their father, for help all the time, right? And there's this so I mean, I just agree that situation in the world is sort of like in incredible addiction to, the handouts and certain type of authority is been indoctrinated into us, and the first thing we can do is, you know, post angry memes on Facebook and, ask the government for more stuff. And the idea that we could get that stuff from each other is has become foreign. I mean, and I think, I'm lucky to be in Kenya for a few reasons. I mean, one is that the memory of these systems is very strong, right? Within one generation, and sometimes, anyone over 40 can remember this as a child, and they might even remember that there are songs associated with these traditions. My partner's family, her dad would remember growing up actually in northern France as well, and doing voluntary kind of corvées with his community to do cider, apple cider and stuff like that too. So there is memory. I mean, even in Europe and whatnot, but maybe a bit less of it than there is here. Um, and I hear you. So imagine, yes, there's, like you've got a community somewhere in Europe or whatever that's sort of going off the radar, as you might say, from the national currency system or from government, and government gets upset and says, "Oh, well, we've got to stop this from happening." And I mean, BlackRock just by themselves with their, something like $22 trillion in assets, and governments, coming in with weapons and all that kind of stuff, certainly can stomp over this stuff quite simply in so many different ways. And I do think that there's a limit to their reach and their ability to control in that way. And I think that what I'm really just pointing to with these protocols is that there seems to be kind of a living systems kind of type protocols for connecting. And if those protocols are re-indoctrinated, revived, and also very easy to use technologically, and people can see them, even in just educating children and educating people of like, this is how people used to live. Yes, making agreements and exchanging with each other, like we're exchanging right now. I mean, if you went back to, you know, uh, World War II in some areas, us having this conversation would be illegal. Absolutely, right? I mean, so, for governments to impose themselves in the middle of exchange, right? This is colonization. This is imperialism. This is fascism. It's all of those things that we, kind of know quite well. Um, yeah, so I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't know that there is an answer to me. To me, this is sort of like a cross-pollination or a pollination rebellion, is to say, let's make the tools of connecting really, really extremely easy. And I'm happy that there's this wealth transfer onto blockchain right now, because blockchain makes those things much, much easier. And I don't and second, third generation blockchains that are completely um, free, where you can run a node on your phone totally independently of a blockchain, be able to make connections with us. Those technologies, to me, it's a little bit like nuclear proliferation in a sense. It's or the opposite of that in some ways, where it's, this ability to cross-pollinate becomes easier and easier and easier. It becomes more and more and more expensive for governments to try to stop it, and embarrassing to them, like the example of us in Kenya, where you're really trying to stop someone who doesn't have money to trade their tomatoes for school fees. I think that's partially there's to me, there's an opening right now in Europe, in the US, towards this kind of stuff, where it's not yet fully illegal. It's not quite known what it is. There's a regulatory gap right now, which, I'm sure, is there's a lot of governments trying to close that gap as fast as they possibly can, and others where it's tentatively open right now. And so there's sort of an exciting moment. And there's another thing around just the heritage element that I love too, where, most, like even Kenya, it says that traditional practices are allowed, many types of traditional practices. And so if you can actually really just say has nothing to do with tech innovation, right? We're using technology to implement some protocols that are so ancient that all of our ancestors used them. And if you can, UNESCO, World Heritage, intangible heritage, all this stuff, it's quite real as well. And so there's a little bit of, if I come at this, or you come at this as a Elon Musk tech bro solutionism, techno solution, I think that's a total failure. And if we can take it back into real basic principles and basic connection, I think we have a lot of firepower. And again, doing this stuff as a nonprofit, being able to just connect people together, it's extremely embarrassing to put me in jail, right? Like, and to do so again, even more embarrassing, right? So it's like, and so the more people that are doing this stuff in a very open way, I've been reading it. There's a really good podcast. I'll try to find it on the chat here, but on revolutions, that's out. And half of the revolutionary stuff that you see there is just, the public getting tired of the shit, over time. So yeah, let me stop there.
Will, our first guest on this series was Steve Keen. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's an Australian, I guess you would categorize him as a heterodox economist. He's very critical of neoclassical economics. He's very focused on climate issues, and he's got a pretty grim outlook on the future, on the catastrophes that are waiting for us, and on the, quite frankly, the number of people who are going to make it through to the other side. I asked him, he thinks climate catastrophe is the most pressing problem, and he thinks that it's pretty imminent. I don't have an opinion on that subject. It's just not one that I've had the time or inclination to research for myself. But but I asked him, how many people, what percentage of the current population of the world do you think is going to make it through the imminent catastrophe? And he said 10%. So that's pretty catastrophic. That means over 7 billion people are going to die. I hope he's wrong, obviously. But the question in my mind is, as we try to visualize paths into the future, are there any conceivable paths that don't involve mass death? Because the scale and scope of modern production and distribution is so inconceivably big and complicated that it's hard to imagine how a rebuilding from the ground up can build lifeboats big enough to accommodate 8 billion people, or 4 billion people, or 1 billion people. So my question for you is can we get from here to there without losing most of the people who we've currently got alive on Earth? Can you envision a path through all of the existential threats that we're currently facing, which gets most of the people through to the other side?
I mean, I think half of there's just this huge focus on fear and crisis right now, especially with media. And like I mean, for me, it's like, imagine you're standing on the precipice of massive deforestation, or the last rainfall that you'll ever see in the rest of your life, or something like this. And you look around at the people around you, and you see that we can all still hold hands, we can still help each other, we can all still exchange resources and stories and laugh. And to me, that's really what's key. And so to me, it's like, I work, with folks in India that are, and worked in a lot of informal settlements, which are, open sewage on the streets and all this kind of stuff, and living in a way that most, say, Americans wouldn't ever imagine, being able to live, or living around Maasais that can walk 50 kilometers at a go, scratching trees to get a little piece of sap off that tree to make a gum arabic in Somalia. I can't even imagine it. So it's hard for me to even imagine that, but it's all around us right now. And I see that the people in those places are really getting by, and in a way thriving with each other by caring for each other. And that trust, these ancient traditions that are still there in the refugee camps we work with, we have Somalians, Ethiopians, South Sudanese, Ugandans, Kenyans, that all share this ancient heritage. They all call it totally different names. Like, it's called Goob, in Goob in Somalia, but it's the exact same traditions, the same protocols for supporting each other. And so to me, It's like imagine you're a bunch of little mossy plants on the side of a giant mountain, and there's a little sections of um, dirt on that mountain, and you're still doing the protocol of life and caring and forming connections with each other, and that's it. And I don't know that there's anything else we can do except try to do that more and try to do it better and as much as we possibly can and not focus and get lost in fear and how many people are going to die and all this kind of stuff because it's just that's immobilizing half the time and half of the memes and all these all this kind of anger and shame and apathy that you see on social media right now is it's stagnating and I actually there's something about I try to really actively kind of confront that and say, well, can we not plan something? If the world's dying tomorrow, well, maybe we should have a little barbecue, you know? I mean, geez, like we're just gonna all go into depression and just quit or somehow. It's just that's inconceivable to me. And so it's just um so I don't know what the future holds, and I'm hopeful that the little mangrove creek down below me is going to thrive. When I go to France, I see these beautiful rivers and green countryside that looks like it could survive another 10,000 years potentially. I mean, there's abundance in this planet, huge abundance. There's abundance in nature, there's abundance in our connections with each other. We just have to see that and get out of these little silos and kind of, prison planet mentality that we've gotten ourselves into. And yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes before we hit the 2-hour mark, and I do want to take some time to let folks know more about your organization, your field guide, how they can connect with you. But before that, I want to ask one more question related to where we just were, which is I live in Lima, Peru, which is an enormous city. It's bigger than any city in the United States. I've spent most of my life in big cities, New York City, Tokyo, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And I'm trying to think about someone who lives in that realm, taking in this perspective and saying, okay, what do I do with my life? Let's say I'm a corporate lawyer working in a mega corporation in New York City. Is the way that I take this message that I need to quit my law job and move out of New York City and move closer to the land and become part of a rural community raising food and completely reorient my life? Or are there insights that are being birthed here which can allow me to stay where I am, to continue doing what I do, but to orient it differently, and to address concerns and perspectives that were just not even on my radar screen before hearing this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I go back to that protocol. If you're curating the value around you, if you can identify all the shops that you buy from, if you can identify everyone that provides value to you in your life, and you can identify the value you offer in return for that, that's a curation already. You are curating what's valuable around you. You're already assigning relative value of those things. You're already doing all this stuff. So, people in Peru, I think we're always doing these types of functions just to bring those into consciousness. You're limiting how much of any one of those things, goes through your holding, of what you find valuable, and you're practicing exchange through those. So the idea that of us kind of being conscious, kind of formalizing that connection around us to say, well, this is my value network. If that is simply going to all of those businesses that you work with and having them create, or they probably already have some form of commitment or like a gift card that you hold and enable flow through in your community. In other words, if I could go to 5 of the businesses around me, they all create gift cards. I need those things. I'm going to hold a certain number of those, and I'm going to enable other people to use and flow through my basket right here. That in and of itself, in some ways, is already kind of what's happening, but we're not doing it in a way that enables the connection between us to start flowing. So that's, a real basics. That's kind of, think about it like a heart. It enables pumping and flow of resources through the system without having to go into these central sources that could quite well die, right? So the national currency, for instance, or your boss or whatever, right? So, and being able to connect, cross-pollinate, that's one thing. The other thing that's really important is this stewardship. If you think of that as the heart, there's some sort of mind as well that's actually doing this process collectively or individually. We focus that stewardship effort here a lot on. I mean, there's a whole bunch of practices around that as well. But in Uganda, I worked with a group that did this thing they call it a visionary approach to community action planning, and that's a lot of this where you're looking at your vision, you're coming up with a vision for the next year. What are you trying to achieve? Drawing it usually, communities that can't do writing, just what does that look like for your home? You can do that as groups as well. There's a bunch of techniques for that. Theory U is quite nice for doing visionary work as well, if you're familiar with it. And then doing asset mapping, resource mapping. What is the current reality around you? Where am I? And then looking at that tension. What's the tension between where you want to be and where you are right now? Okay. And if that tension makes you want to grow local food, beautiful, right? That's part of your vision. You want to have more fresh food. You're in a situation where you're eating a bunch of processed crap or whatever, wonderful, right? Find where your vision is, find where you currently are, feel that tension. That's a positive tension, right? It's like, it's like a rubber band being pulled, right? It's pointing you in a direction, and you want to basically release, you want to go from where you are to where you need to be. And the method of getting there, and we do things like working with smart action steps, specific measurable time down. We do a lot of planning, type activities, but a lot of it's around resources, right? You have resources. We all have resources. How do we combine those resources together in a fair way to reach from our current reality to our vision, right? How do we go from here to there? How do we release that tension in a positive direction and keep doing that as a society? And I think that's just what we need to keep doing. And more consciously as individuals and communities. And I mean, in terms of like all this kind of fear of like, are you going to get trapped in a city when there's a crisis and disaster and all this kind of stuff? It to me, it's like, if you don't have community around you, none of that matters. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter anywhere you are, but if you don't have, and what is community? Well, it's that overlapping of your vision and value together. Oh, over. And just a quick comment with Yaniv made a comment around Christians, and I work with a lot of Christian groups. I'm not trying to dismiss them with my comment earlier, but I noticed a lot of um, um, sort of a push of the early Christian colonial systems to sort of infantilize people to, again, wait for a handout, wait for God to do something. And I feel like, I mean, my background is as a Presbyterian, and if you go in the history of Presbyterians, there's a huge push for how do we as a community actually come together and uh, help each other. And I think that's, I mean, the huge amount of teachings around Christianity are around that. And if you look at a lot of the ancient, monastic traditions, it's all the same stuff. And even, we work with Islamic groups as well, and you get the exact same traditions going back as well. So yeah, over. I see you, Yaniv, got his hand
All right,
up
yeah,
again.
Giannis has his hand up. I will bring you back in momentarily, but I I do want to give Will an opportunity to talk about his field guide. Will, you were kind enough to share a pre-publication, I guess, version of your field guide, but you said that just in the past couple of days, it became ready for public consumption. If I understood you correctly, do you want to tell us about the field guide, what it is, and where people can get a look at it?
Sure. I'll stick the link again here. There's a link there where you can download it as a PDF. It's an open source, Creative Commons piece. And you can also there's a way to download or order a physical book as well. But basically, it's for years and years we've been working with humanitarian organizations mostly, but we've had to do best practices, what didn't work, what did work. I mean, we've done so many different types of experiments across so many different groups, and so just kind of putting that all together. It's based on a lot of we have a lot of field guides we work with. Community groups. It goes through, there's kind of two parts. One is kind of the first part is reflections and kind of philosophy around economics. And then the second part is focused on a lot of the stuff like the visionary process, kind of action steps, little case studies and whatnot. So yeah, to me, it's just it's just a gift and a way of just kind of I'm from a science background, so if you don't write it down, it's not science. So it's just keeping notes, for me, and hopefully it's interesting to folks. And there's a lot of kind of musings there and going into, the first chapters around mycorrhizal fungi and talking about resource coordination around, those types of systems and also looking at, I go a bit into, extraction and centralization as well. And if you look at a lot of these protocols that we're talking about, well, you could see BlackRock, for instance, doing these same types of protocols, but they're also very specifically trying to stop, they're certainly pooling different types of commitments and resources. They're certainly doing some types of exchange, and they're extracting value in that process. And they're also trying to stop anyone else from doing the same thing, right? That's kind of the distinction with a lot of these kind of, dominating practices, is that they're certainly doing something like, common resource pooling, but they're trying to only make it so that you go through their pool, and that's it. Essentially, it's like a cancerous growth. And I use the kind of analogy of a giant pumpkin. So, I hope you like it. There's a lot of kind of ancient stories in there as well that kind of talk about these practices as well. So yeah.
All right, I will put a link to that as well as Grassroots Economics when this video is posted to YouTube. The folks who are with us today on Zoom can see that link in the chat, but the chat does not make it to the YouTube video. All right, couple of minutes left here, so Giannis can come back. Let me bring you back on screen. Go right ahead.
Um, I wanted to touch a little bit on your reference to Trump. Now, you made it kind of ambivalent, so I got it as if you have like a negative view of Trump. But as a corollary to that, I would like to ask what you think of this with a stroke of a pen axing of like USAID, which I think for projects like yours would be like the primary colonialist establishment enemy. And do you think that would you see that as kind of like an optimistic development? I mean, we don't know how it's gonna turn out, but do you think that as a radical move forward, or you say, oh no, why did he do that? We need USAID, blah blah blah. And so I would like you to comment a little bit of
Yeah.
it, just because you made the reference.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff I hear coming out of Trump is horrible, but I've also heard some stuff that he says that sounds in some ways revolutionary, in terms of what he's looking at doing around taxation and whatnot. So anyway, I really try to take the political realm and say, again, kind of like how I deal with a lot of these memes and whatnot, and say, well, what are we doing on the ground? Really just focus there. And that's pretty much all I can do to stay sane in the world. Um, but in terms of the USAID stuff, I, if you look at the amount of corruption in the humanitarian world, it is so extreme and so horrible that it appears as if much of the humanitarian world is simply meant to keep the status quo or worse. That's been my experience for 16 years here with most of these things. And I remember early, I mean, probably it was 2012 or something, someone sent me a USAID application for funding. And so we thought, okay, well, let's just try. And so we wrote to them and explained the situation, explained kind of the solution, gave examples of war goal, gave, all this stuff. And their reply back was, because we were talking about scarcity of national currency and being able to do alternative, ways of exchange. And they said, well, lack of currency is not a problem. There's plenty of currency. And I'm like, oh. And that was it. And so we never got to hear. So we've never gotten funded by any sort of those large. I mean, but then again, we've had partnerships with groups like the Red Cross and World Food Program. But what's been good about those partnerships is that had feet on the ground. They had these what were called like innovation departments that were implementing stuff, and we could just train them and show them what we do and sort of hand over. And that's been a really nice way for us to sort of decenter ourselves, and just whoever wants to learn these types of systems, go ahead. And wonderful. And actually, one thing that's Red Cross in particular has liked about these programs is that they could do this kind of pulling together and pooling and seeding and be able to walk away in a way that they couldn't before. And so that was good. So they can die, in other words, in a good way. They could leave, the situation and not create this constant dependency on themselves. So that's been really, really healthy, I think, in some ways. So I've enjoyed in a lot of these, the departments within these organizations, that the bigger NGOs and whatnot, they have a lot of diehard people that really want to see change. Often they're within these institutions that have a huge amount of problems and hierarchies and corruption. So it's like, it's trying to turn the Titanic quite often. So yeah, I'm hopeful in a way about the USAID thing, and even what I'm hearing about like the US Treasury, that I'm hopeful that there's a reassessment. I mean, gosh, it's time for reassessment for sure. And hopefully that's done in a positive way. And I'm really happy, somehow it sounds like a lot of corruption is being exposed. But we'll see.
Will, we've just passed the 2-hour mark. We've got one more hand raised. You got time to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Ed Dodson, who just happens to be our guest for our next episode, is our last question of the show.
Well, looking at the international picture with regard to the commons, what's your view of things like the Law of the Sea Treaty as an effective international agreement, if you have an opinion?
Yeah, I don't know that particular one, but I've done some study of nautical contracts, and I work quite a bit and with a colleague named Chris Cook, who does a lot of studies of these things, and essentially contract law, international agreements, agreements that are essentially beyond jurisdiction. It's connections between agents are extremely powerful, and I think that that's essentially what we're looking at when we look at these ancient practices as well. You're looking at an agreement space, right? And these are generally opt-in agreements, right? Where you decide, and there's the form of all of these agreements, I think is something we just need to study more and more. So I think that's exactly the space that's really beautiful about all this stuff. Like we're looking at like land trust type agreements, but instead of focusing on the ownership question, we're focused much more on how does someone within a community say, I have these resources, like this Friday, for instance, we're working with a bunch of community groups around water access and making 3-party, 4-party agreements on how they're going to access water, and going back to a lot of these forms, like the commitment pooling type protocols around how that works. So yeah, maybe you can say more about, what you're liking about those contracts.
Well, it's pretty involved, but it seems to me that at least it's a recognition that the planet's resources ought to be shared under some equitable basis. Whether or not the actual enforcement of the agreement results in that outcome is the other issue, of course. But at least it's a starting point. That's, I guess, my view.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Maybe in the chat you can put a link or the name of that agreement. I'd love to look at it.
Just the law of the sea treaty. That's all it
Okay.
is.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Will, it was a privilege and a pleasure to sit down and hear your perspective. Like I said, you along with Tim Jenkin were the people who inspired the creation of this series. I think what you're doing is fantastic and inspirational, and hopefully you'll get a few more eyeballs on what you're doing by virtue of having joined us. So thank you, and wish you all the best.
Thanks so much, Josh. Great to be here. Keep doing what you're doing too.